There's a basement door buried under San Francisco that was never supposed to exist. Not because someone made a drafting error, though errors were made. Not because the records were poorly kept, though records burned along with everything else, but because of what the workers found when their excavation equipment hit something solid in the rubble, something that no surviving map in any archive, insurance ledger or property deed had ever drawn a single line to represent. The year is 1906 and the city is gone. You already know the broad outline. The earthquake before dawn, the gas lines rupturing, the fires that burned for 3 days because the water mains had shattered and there was almost nothing left to fight with. 18 months later, maybe 2 years, the rebuilding crews are moving through what used to be specific addresses on specific streets. They are clearing lots, they are grading, they are laying new foundations over the compressed memory of a neighborhood that existed in one form on Monday morning and didn't exist at all by Wednesday night. This is the moment San Francisco tries to forget that it is building on top of itself. And this is exactly the moment a shovel or a survey stake or a backhoe blade finds the edge of something that is not rubble. Something with angles, something constructed. The door sits at a depth that immediately tells you it was not part of the building that fell on top of it. The debris overhead is charred, compressed, layered in the way that fire and collapse and 2 years of weather create a kind of geological record you can read if you know what to look for. Below that compressed layer, the entrance shows up at a different angle, built into a different era's material. The brickwork around the frame is older, not by decades necessarily, but old enough that the mortar has a different composition, a different colour when you chip at the edge of it. The men who find it don't have the language of archaeology to describe what they're seeing, but they understand what they're feeling, which is the particular unease of encountering a human-made space that everyone else has forgotten about. The physical clues accumulate quickly. The door itself, or what's left of it, is heavy. The hinges are not hardware store hardware. They are the kind of ironwork you commissioned, the kind you paid extra for, because you expected the door to be used seriously, and often, or perhaps because you expected it to hold against something. The soot on the exterior wall near the frame runs in a specific direction that doesn't match the burn pattern of the building above. This matters. It means the fire that touched this entrance came from a different source, at a different time, possibly moving in a different direction than the conflagration that consumed the street-level structure. Someone or something was burning down here, or the heat was travelling through passages the fire inspectors never catalogued. Deeper in, past the threshold, there is debris of a different character. Not the collapsed ceiling material you'd expect from a building that fell in on itself from above. Instead, there is sediment. There is the kind of slow accumulation that happens when a space is sealed and then forgotten rather than suddenly destroyed. Broken glass, but glass that broke from thermal stress rather than impact. Personal objects that will matter enormously later, but in this first moment of discovery, what matters is the layout. The room continues, it connects to something else, and none of that is on any document that survived. This is where the historical significance of the door stops being just an interesting anomaly and becomes something more disturbing. San Francisco in the years before 1906 was a city that kept extraordinary records because extraordinary money was moving through it. The insurance industry alone produced detailed Sanborn fire maps, floor-by-floor diagrams of virtually every commercial and residential structure in the urban core, drawn with the obsessive precision that insurance underwriters require when they are calculating exactly how much they stand to lose. Those maps survived the earthquake because copies existed in offices outside California. Historians have them. Researchers have combed through them for more than a century. And this room, this basement, this door at this depth, at this address, does not appear on any of them. The property deed for the lot shows a building of a certain square footage. The building permit, pulled years before the earthquake, describes a structure with a specific number of floors and a specific foundation type. The insurance valuation agrees with the permit, All of these documents describe a building that could not have contained the space now sitting open in the excavation cut. Either the documents are wrong, which happens, or the space was added after the permits were filed without any official record of the modification, which also happens, or the space was there before the building that the documents describe and was never incorporated into the official record at all. Each of those possibilities means something different about what this place was and who wanted it kept quiet. Because that question is unavoidable once you've stood at the entrance and looked at the evidence. A routine service basement gets built into the permit. A coal storage room, a boiler room, a cold larder. These things appear on the Sanborn maps because the insurance agent who drew the map walked through the property and measured it. You don't accidentally omit a room from an insurance survey unless the person giving you the tour doesn't open that door, which means either the surveyor was careless or the owner was careful. So what was this space? The possibilities sit in a line, and none of them are comfortable. A refuge, possibly, built by someone who understood before 1906 that San Francisco was a city that occasionally needed to disappear into itself, whether from fire or from the attention of other people. A vault, maybe, where something of enough value to justify a concealed entrance was kept below the reach of casual discovery. An extension of something that no longer exists above ground because the earthquake and fire erased whatever structure originally connected to it. Or something else entirely, something that required the kind of architectural discretion that leaves no paper trail on purpose. The workers who break through in the excavation are not historians. They have a job to do and a schedule to meet, and a foreman who wants the lot cleared by a certain date. But the door stops them. Even in a city that is trying very hard to move forward, to rebuild, to pretend that the version of San Francisco that existed before April 18th was simply a rough draft of the real city now emerging from the ash. Even in that climate of deliberate forgetting, a door that shouldn't exist makes everyone stop, makes everyone look at each other, makes everyone ask the same question out loud before they've even stepped inside. What is this place, and why didn't anyone want us to know it was here? The first thing they see inside is that the room is not finished like a casual afterthought. The walls are true brick, not the rough stone you would expect from an improvised crawl space or a hastily dug coal bin. The courses are tight, the corners sharp. Whoever laid this went back over the joints with care. The mortar lines are finer than the building that fell on top of it, and under the dust you can still see traces of lime wash, the faint suggestion that at some point someone cared how this space looked, even if few people were ever meant to see it. The floor is another problem. It is not earth. It is not the uneven patched concrete that shows up in service basements all over the city. Here, the surface is laid in brick pavers, running in a pattern that makes sense if you assume heavy traffic and heavy loads. There are scars in the pattern where something sat for a long time and was then removed long before the fire. Shallow indentations faint rust prints in a rectangle like shelving or cabinets that never made it into any inventory list. Against one wall, near what might have been the original entrance before the door they discovered, the workers find glass, not just broken bottles, but fragments that repeat. Short, thick-necked bottles with what's left of paper labels fused to the glass by heat. In the right light, under the soot, you can pick out letters in old typefaces. Bit on one, Ers on another. The kind of proprietary tonic or medicinal alcohol every commercial block in pre-quake San Francisco had stacked in its back rooms. Nearby, long-necked beer bottles, some still with wired closures, some with the brass of a once-polished tap fixture corroded into green. There are tools, too, but not the big implements of trade. No mining picks, no shipyard gear, instead smaller things. A ledger ruler with inch markings worn down from repeated use. A keyring fused into a single lump, the teeth of each key distinct enough that if you had the patience and a reference, you could probably match them to locks that no longer exist. A metal stamp, the kind used to mark crates or receipts, with the backwards ghost of a name punched into its face. The name doesn't match the business registered at that address on any surviving list. They find shelving brackets still bolted into the brick, though whatever wood once sat on them is long gone. They find a line of iron pipe running along the ceiling, branching into smaller feeds, then dead-ending at capped valves. No gas meter, no fixture you would associate with lighting. The pipes are too thick for a simple water line, too oddly routed for a standard boiler. One segment disappears into a wall that, according to every document, should have opened into the neighbouring property, but here is solid and blind. Taken individually, none of these objects announce themselves as extraordinary. String them together and the shape that emerges is not a family storage cellar where someone put up preserves and forgot them, and not a simple stockroom for the shop that once operated at street level. This is a controlled, deliberate environment designed to hold things of value and move things in and out in a way that didn't invite questions. Then the earthquake and the fires arrive in the story, not as abstract disaster, but as an explanation for how a room like this falls out of the city's memory. The floor above collapses, but at askew, because the newer foundation fails differently than the older brick shell below. Heavy timbers crash down near, but not through the room, bridging just enough to keep the ceiling from pancaking. Fire races along the street, drops into basements where gas lines have snapped and coal stores ignite, and then starves out where oxygen runs thin. What doesn't burn fills with smoke and superheated air. Glass shatters not from impact, but from the shock of temperature change. Labels carbonize, ink fades. In the weeks that follow, the priority is not forensics, it's survival. Engineers and city officials redraw the grid. In some places, the grade is raised by several feet to smooth out the topography. In others, ash and brick are bulldozed into low spots and compacted into new ground. Basements that should have been dug out are instead buried because the schedule says the new city must rise, and it must rise quickly. A forgotten room that isn't collapsing, that isn't obviously dangerous, can become just another void under the new layer of normal. By the time the Sanborn surveyors come back to update their maps, the building that will later collapse over this basement is on the site. The owner walks them through the visible spaces. The tape measure runs along the walls the city recognizes. The surveyor's pencil outlines the floors he can access. The hidden door, now shielded behind some piece of cabinetry or sealed flush to resemble part of a wall, stays shut. On paper, in the company's archive, in the municipal records, the property becomes perfectly ordinary. This is the gap historians and archaeologists have to work inside when something like this comes back into the light. The physical evidence says one thing: brickwork of a certain style, mortar with a certain composition, bottles of brands that were marketed in certain decades and then vanished, carpentry scars at heights that match the shelving practices of known businesses. The written record, when it exists at all, says something else, or says nothing. So they proceed the way they always do with incomplete worlds. They date the bricks by comparing them to other structures whose construction is documented. They look at nail types, glass thickness, embossing on bottle bases. They bring in preservation specialists who know how fire distorts materials and can tell the difference between heat from an open flame and heat conducted through walls from a distant blaze. They sift the soil in the corners for seeds, rodent bones, insect remains, whatever might hint at whether food was ever stored here, whether people sheltered here during the fire, whether the room was active right up to 1906, or had already been abandoned. What emerges is not a single clean story, but a spectrum of possibilities, each anchored to evidence with different degrees of confidence. It looks very much like a commercial basement, but not the one listed on the permit. The bottles and crates suggest inventory, but the missing records suggest inventory that wasn't supposed to be taxed, inspected, or insured. The heavy hinges and reinforced door point to concern about access or about a raid or about a panicked crowd in an emergency. But none of those details alone can tell you whether this was an illegal liquor storehouse, a private vault for a nearby bank, a secure storeroom for a politically sensitive organization, or simply a cautious merchant's overbuilt cellar. Local stories rush in to fill the gaps. In bars not far from the excavation, people will tell you this was part of a tunnel network used by smugglers during Prohibition, even though the dates don't quite line up and the objects in the debris predate the Volstead Act. Others swear it was connected to the city's underworld gambling dens or crib districts, a place to move cash and contraband physically under the respectable streets. Old-timers remember hearing about secret rooms where political clubs stashed ballot boxes or ledgers they didn't want subpoenaed. The basement, mute and stripped of context, becomes a mirror in which the city sees every version of its own past misbehaviour. Serious researchers draw harder lines. This fragment of a crate label matches a wholesaler known to supply saloons in the district. That style of metal stamp was common for customs brokers operating near the waterfront. This specific configuration of pipes appears in other documented buildings that housed cold storage rooms, suggesting an early refrigeration system tied to shared infrastructure. From this you can build a plausible reconstruction, a semi-official storeroom maybe, serving multiple small businesses that didn't want or couldn't get full insurance, built onto an older foundation and then erased by catastrophe and speed. And yet, even with all of that, the basement never fully resolves into a single agreed-upon identity. The absence of a line on a map, the absence of a line in a ledger, is its own kind of data, but it is negative data. It tells you someone kept this space off the books. It does not tell you why. What it does reveal with unnerving clarity is less about one room and more about the city that grew on top of it. San Francisco after 1906 didn't simply rebuild. It layered itself. Streets were straightened, hills were cut down, rubble was used as fill. Old foundations became footings for new ones. Entire basements were left in place because hauling out the debris cost more than pouring a new slab over the top. Within a generation, people walked through downtown unaware that beneath their feet were pre-quake sidewalks, buried doorways, culverts from long-forgotten streams, and rooms like this one sealed by convenience and amnesia. This basement is proof that the official story told by maps and permits is only the topmost layer. Underneath lies a physical archive of choices the city preferred not to document. Unlicensed businesses, off-the-books infrastructure, informal housing, improvised shelters that were tolerated until they weren't. Each earthquake, each redevelopment project, each new wave of construction cuts a cross-section through those layers and exposes a sliver of what used to be real enough to build in brick and mortar, but not real enough to record. There is a limit to how much certainty you can extract from a space like this. You can say with confidence what the bricks are, roughly when they were laid, what brands of liquor once sat on these shelves, how hot the fire got, how long the room stayed sealed. Beyond that you move into careful speculation, and beyond that into story. The most honest thing you can say is that the basement was used for something someone thought was important and someone else thought was better left unmentioned. In that uncertainty there is a kind of invitation. Because if one sealed doorway can open into an undocumented chapter of a city everyone thinks they already know, it means the ground under every rebuilt block might be hiding similar rooms, similar omissions. Cities do not simply forget, they build over their own memories, turning human lives and decisions into anonymous layers of brick, ash and fill. If you want to see more of those layers, more lost basements, buried streets and erased rooms that still shape the places we live, tell me in the comments which city's hidden history you'd like to dig into next.